Hello, everyone. I'm Richard Schmier, the President and Chairman of the Board of the Middle East Policy Council, and I'm pleased to welcome all of you to today's program. For this, our 111th Capitol Hill Conference, we have assembled an outstanding panel of speakers to address the timely issue of energy transition and the future of energy in the Middle East. We look forward to a robust discussion of that issue with our panelists. Today's Capitol Hill Conference is our 12th to be held virtually since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic in the spring of 2020. But we do hope to return to our in-person panel discussions on Capitol Hill with our next Capitol Hill Conference. This format, however, does give us the opportunity to include panelists and audience members from throughout the US and around the world. So welcome to all of you who are joining us from both near and afar. Before I turn to today's program, I would like to say a few words about the Middle East Policy Council. The Council was established in 1981 for the purpose of promoting dialogue and education concerning the US and the countries of the Middle East. 2023 marks our 42nd year of such contributions to the US Middle East dialogue. Among our core programs are our quarterly Capitol Hill conferences, such as today's event, our quarterly journal, Middle East Policy, which can be found in more than 16,000 libraries around the world, and our educational outreach program, Teach Mideast, which provides educational resources on the Middle East geared for secondary school students and teachers. We also have several products focused on the informational needs of embassies and Capitol Hill staff. Please visit us on the web at www.mepc.org and our Teach Mideast program at www.teachmideast.org to learn more about our organization and our activities. Concerning today's event, the conference proceedings will be posted in video and transcript form on our website, as will a recap of the program. An edited transcript will be published in the next issue of our journal, Middle East Policy. Now let me turn to today's distinguished panelists. Our first speaker will be Ms. Melanie Kenderdine, Principal and Executive Vice President of the Energy Futures Initiative, a senior fellow in the Atlantic Council's Global Energy Center, and a former energy counselor to the Secretary of Energy at the U.S. Department of Energy. Ms. Kenderdine will be followed by Dr. Kaushik Deb, senior research scholar at the Center on Global Energy Policy in Columbia University's School of International and Public Affairs. And finally, our third speaker will be Ms. Tofel Al-Nasser, a partner at Dalilak Consulting and a recent awardee in MEPC's 2023 40 Under 40 program. She is also a former diplomat assigned to OPEC and a former executive at ExxonMobil and Qatar Energy. The moderator of today's discussion will be Ms. Bassema Al-Hussein, the Executive Director of the Middle East Policy Council. Before turning the floor over to Ms. Kenderdine, I would like to provide some background on our decision to address this topic at this time. As is well known, the Middle East, and in particular, the countries of the Gulf, are major producers and exporters of fossil fuels. As is also well known, the global community is working in concert to abate climate change by supporting efforts to reduce dependence on fossil fuels and develop non-greenhouse gas emitting renewable energy sources. In November, a delegation from MEPC visited the Gulf and had the opportunity to be briefed by government and energy company officials on their approach to the issue of energy transition in light of the global effort to reduce the use of fossil fuels. These briefings reflected what we perceived to be an appreciation by oil and gas producing countries of their need to participate in the energy transition being sparked by the efforts to combat climate change. Our sense was that while they remained committed to producing fossil fuels, they also understood that the use of such fuels would be changing. Rather than being burned as a source of energy, fossil fuels would be used more in producing the petrochemical products needed by modern industrial economies, and would largely be supplanted in energy production by renewable energy sources, in particular by solar. And of course, the region's abundant sunshine would make this area very competitive in large-scale, cost-effective solar energy production. We also learned of breakthroughs and accelerated efforts at carbon capture and sequestration. Thus, in light of these global and regional developments, this seemed like an ideal time to bring this issue to MEPC's public policy-focused community. So as we turn to a discussion of this issue, let me first ask all attendees to be sure to mute your microphones. And please do submit your questions to the panelists during the program through the email address info, that is info, @mepc.org, or through the Zoom chat function. With that, I'm pleased to turn the floor over to Ms. Kenderdime to begin the discussion. Melanie?
Great, and thank you so much, Richard, and thank you to the MEPC for pulling this event together and inviting me to participate. I am going to pull up some slides here. This always takes a minute on Zoom, so any rate, pretty fast, actually. So I'm going to talk about the role of natural gas in a deeply decarbonized world, and in particular, the MENA region. The Energy Futures Initiative is a think tank. We do analysis. We have done Global Gas Phase 1, and I'll talk about that in a second. We have launched Global Gas Phase 2. We had a workshop on that yesterday. And so natural gas, of course, will be a focus of what I'm going to be talking about, but I'm going to talk about a few other things as well. And I hope to provide a little context for the rest of the discussion and for the people in the audience. And so can everyone see this? Is this working? Great. Okay. Thank you so much. Any rate, I want to, and this has been worrying me for some time, what I'd like to say too, I have spent a great deal of time in the Middle East. I worked for the Department of Energy for 8 years in the Clinton administration and 4 years in the Obama administration. When you work at the Department of Energy, you go to the Middle East a lot. So I have been to many of these countries. Number one number of stamps on my passport is Turkey at 14, but I have been to Saudi Arabia 11 times. So I have a huge interest in the Middle East and have been very, very worried about a region that basically has two main sources of revenue, oil and gas, and what it means to the populations in these countries, the clean energy transition and what that means. And so what you're seeing here, this is the MENA region population. There are different definitions of the MENA region. I'm using this one. And so the population, the red is 2021, the blue is 2050. And then where you see that asterisk there, that means that country is in the top 50 countries in the world. There are about 200 countries in the top 50 in population in 2050. So it's not inconsequential. And so you can see the difference in Morocco's population between 2021 and 2050 it increases by 21%, Algeria 35%, Tunisia 16%, Libya 27%, Egypt 46%. I'll say a little bit more about that in a second. Saudi Arabia 34%, Yemen 66%, Oman 40%, UAE 21%, I can't see it. There are faces over the number there, but you can see that. Qatar, 26%. Bahrain, can't see that one either. 20%. Kuwait, 24%. Jordan, 35%. Iran, 12%. Iraq, 70%. Syria, 79%. Lebanon is the only region in a country in the region that loses population, and then Israel at 38%. So you can see there, Syria, Iraq, and Yemen, very large increases in population, percentage-wise. In absolute numbers, Egypt has the highest increase in numbers. So I do this because I think it is hugely important that we pay attention to the needs of the populations in these countries as we transition to clean energy. And total population increase in the region by 2050, it's going to 662 million people, and a very significant increase percentage-wise as well. This is global warming by country and region in 2021. And you can see there, the Middle East is there, and Iraq, 2.3 degrees, Kuwait, 2.5. I think Kuwait is the most significant increase. Almost all in the 2-degree range. You can see Algeria, Libya, others over here, Tunisia and Morocco, and so, but all a few with 1.5 degrees, but most with 2 degrees plus. So and obviously it's a warm region already, so it's an issue as well. I've also looked at global water stress, and this is from the World Resources Institute. What you see there, the 28% of the world lives in water scarce countries. Experts estimate by 2080, this number will go to 43 to 50% living in water stressed regions. Extremely high is this dark red you see here. The entire MENA region, with the exception of Egypt, and that's low to medium water stress, but the entire region besides Egypt is water stressed. This is important from an energy perspective. Conventional nuclear energy consumes large volumes of water, and making green hydrogen with water is also a very large water need from an energy perspective. And so in a water scarce region that will be increasingly water scarce, those two technologies for clean energy could be problematic absent a lot of desalination. I know there's a fair amount of that in the region, but just want to make the point about those two sources using a lot of water. And I mentioned the Energy Futures Initiative that we have done a study, phase 1, global gas phase 1, and that we launched global gas phase 2 yesterday at a major workshop. The first phase, all we did, now I want to say all, but what we did was we went to think tanks around the world and had those think tanks pull in experts in energy and in natural gas, and then compiled the results and the thinking of the experts in those regions about the role of natural gas and other issues in the regions. The needs are very different. We knew it's very regional in the United States, very regional in the world as well. And you can see there, the MENA was one of our regions. And so that we rolled that study out, Atlantic Council, in June of 2021. And these are cross-cutting issues from all the workshops. So there was agreement on all of these issues at all of the workshops. They all express a commitment to reducing greenhouse gases. There was shared agreement that there is a role for natural gas in a decarbonized global economy, significant regional differences there, but all agree that gas will have an ongoing role. Global emissions, we're way behind in global emissions reductions, so we need to accelerate efforts. We need innovation in clean energy technologies. The cost of natural gas in some of these regions was important relative to other clean energy technologies. So clean energy technologies, if they're more expensive, would have a tough time competing. Innovative business models are needed for project financing and to build out infrastructure. And we need resilient, reliable, and secure energy systems. I think this has been driven home by the Ukraine crisis here in very significant ways. And then finally, U.S. is the #1 LNG exporter in the world. We didn't approve exports of LNG until I was at the Energy Department in 2015 with Secretary Moniz. So in 7-8 years, we have become the largest LNG exporter in the world. That's had huge geostrategic value with what's going on in Russia and Ukraine. So this is the MENA region coming out of that workshop. I mean the regional workshop that we had, and you can see there CO2 per capita emissions. The world average is 4.9. In the MENA region, it's 5.9. So it's higher than, not surprisingly, higher than the global average. 7.6% of the world's CO2 emissions are from the region's CO2 emissions are from fossil fuels, but it only has 6.3% of world population. So it's an emitter. We all know that. Some of the key findings from the region that were exclusive to the region. Many countries in the region rely on natural gas, 60% or more of their power generation. I'll say a little bit more about that. But the workshops participants really were supportive of renewables. It was mentioned earlier, and the need for battery and storage innovation, et cetera, et cetera. And that natural gas is expected to enable a renewable future. You need natural gas for that. Growing interest in blue hydrogen. As I mentioned, green hydrogen takes a lot of water, tough for a water scarce region. Very interested in blue hydrogen. Accompanying that would be the need for CCS. And the geology in the region is actually quite good for CCS. This is natural gas demand in the region, MENA region, and what the demand is for. So the blue there is power, industry, residential, commercial buildings, transport, and other. And natural gas demand is expected to double by 2040. And power and industry are driving that demand growth. So you can see there, that's your industrial demand growth. So industrial development important in the region, and gas is important for that. And that's your power generation growth in demand by 2040 for natural gas in the MENA region. This is a power generation by energy source in MENA. On the left there, 71% natural gas, oil 20%, coal 3%. That's largely in I think it's in Morocco, and the right is hard to read. Okay, and so wind and solar only 2%. Enormous growth opportunity, not surprising, not a lot of hydro, not a lot of nuclear. And then you see over here, I apologize for these being difficult to read, but the brown line there is natural gas. That's almost all of the countries, huge volumes of natural gas. These are global CCS projects, and there aren't many projects active and commercial deployed CCS projects in the world, but there are 4 in the MENA region. So the red dots are large-scale CCS facilities in operation or under construction. So you've got 2 there. I can't tell where they are. They could be Saudi Arabia, Qatar, or Bahrain. or UAE. And so I think they're UAE. I haven't checked though. Large scale CCS facilities in advanced development. That's another one there in the MENA region. And then a large scale CCS facility completed. You can see that there over in Libya. Okay, so CCS is important to the region, and the region is investing heavily in it. This is important too, as we're talking about the transition. These are jobs created per $1 million of capital investment, and these are IEA numbers. So very important to the MENA region are some of these you see there. Look at this is construction, manufacturing in total. Look at efficiency in buildings. Okay, a lot of jobs, a huge need for a growing population, reducing carbon emissions in the region, and building efficiency. So a lot of jobs created there. You see a lot of jobs in solar PV, very important, and a lot of jobs in hydrogen and in CCUS. So investing in these is important for jobs. You see that population growth in the region, and a transition away from oil and gas. So these are important investments to be made to create jobs in the region. Transport infrastructure, not so much, and industrial efficiency as well, another important. So that's a little on the MENA region specifically. And I'm showing this because I saw a story the other day about how Saudi Arabia and the UK are teaming up and going to be working on the metals and minerals that you need for a clean energy transition. And these data are from the US, but it gives you some idea of how important this issue is going to be in the clean energy transition. And what you see here, the United States Geologic Service survey has an annual report they put out on metals and minerals. This is 2020, not 202. Okay, sorry. That there's typos and everything. And these are on their list, and Navy type, the Navy type here in the text indicates in the boxes indicates that USGS says that is critical for a clean energy future, okay, on their 2022 critical list. And the red type highlights some key energy uses and it's not just clean energy. There are a lot of uses here for conventional energy as well. And so there on that side, there we are 96 to 100% import dependent in the US. And I shouldn't have skipped over that. Sorry. Let me go back. This was a last minute addition. So my apologies. Oops. Just give me, we're all used to this. This and a cat walking in behind somebody's head. Everyone on these Zoom meetings is totally used to these things. So back on this. So arsenic and US 100% dependent. You use it in lumber preservatives, solar cells, etc. Fluorspar, aluminum manufacturing, very important for building out electricity systems needed for electric vehicles, for example. Yttrium, jet engines, metallurgy, et cetera. So that's on the 100% US import dependence. You look over here, vanadium, metal, steel, uranium alloys, platinum, catalytic agents, rhenium, lead-free gasoline. So that's a conventional energy need for these as well. And 75% bauxite used for cement. You're going to need huge amounts of cement for anchoring wind turbines, for example. So just to give you an idea, this is for the US, but the importance of these critical metals and minerals is going to be important for all the countries in the world as we transition to clean energy. Sorry. and I have looked here around the world. These are U.S. import dependence. Green type denotes that we are 100% dependent on imported supply. And so you can see graphite, we are 100% import dependent. We get 17% of that from Canada, Mexico, Peru. I want to get to the Morocco. We are in the MENA region. U.S. is 100% import dependent. We are getting arsenic from Morocco. Keep going around, and the punchline here for the U.S., and it is for the world, is China. Look at that. We are 100% import dependent on many of those, and they are critical for our clean energy transition, and China has most of them. So let me get around the world. You get the point here. And almost through. Then I know that the MENA region has a lot of interest in oil and the transition to electric vehicles and what that means. These are numbers from the International Energy Agency in Paris, and it's their sustainable development scenario, which I think is net zero by 2070. And what you are seeing here is the different types of vehicles. So the big issue there is this turquoise bar, and what this will be to meet those are light duty vehicles. How much you're going to need millions of vehicles to meet this this target in their sustainable development scenario. 5 million light duty vehicles in 2019, 140 million in 2030. So that's going to show you, that shows you a little about the demand for some of these. And plug-in electrics, 1 million in 2019, 60 million in 2030. So you get the picture here. And another demand for metals and minerals. Electric vehicles have a huge amount of copper in them, as do electric transmission lines and transmission towers and wind turbines. They get struck by lightning all the time. This is showing you copper demand in the world, 1,000 kilotons in 2020. In 2030, China alone will demand 1,400 kilotons. So 40% more than the total amount in the world today, EU, US. And this is this is the difference between copper content for an electrical internal combustion engine and a battery EV, 48 pounds to 183 pounds. So again, competition for these in the clean energy future, very important, but it's also competing with other industrial sectors. EVs alone in that sustainable development scenario will need 11.6 million metric tons of copper. Global production in 2020 was 20 million. So, and I looked at what the US uses copper for to give some idea of what other industries we will be competing for. And you can see building, construction, electrical and electronic products, transportation equipment, et cetera, et cetera. And this is what's happened to the price of copper over 5 years because of this increased demand. It's doubled. And you're going to see that for a lot of these metals and minerals in the transition to a clean energy future. So those are just a few thoughts to frame this issue and the issues that the MENA region is going to be facing and the world is going to be facing, how much competition there is going to be for clean energy metals and minerals, but some of the things also that the MENA region can be investing in to help in the clean energy transition and employ the people. That enormous increase in population, employ people as the population grows there. So thank you very much. And I think I'm turning it over to Kosher. So thank you.
Thanks, Melanie. That's going to be a hard act to follow, real tour de force. But I mean, I think kind of the way you started off, saying that you can't talk about energy without talking about the Middle East is absolutely the right way. In fact, I kind of use that as a frame to make my comments as well. The Middle East accounts for about half of the world's proven oil reserves and about 40% of the proven gas reserves. And even today, despite all the projections around energy transition, over half of our primary energy consumption globally is still oil and gas. So you can kind of imagine how important and central the role that in the Middle East and its hydrocarbon reserves play in the global energy world. And the IEA, even in its most aggressive scenarios, has the share of the Middle East supplying hydrocarbons, oil and gas to the rest of the world, only increasing over the next few decades. And Melanie also kind of referenced the Ukraine crisis. I think the role of this region in being able to supply the world's energy needs has become even more crucial after the conflict in Europe, with a real prospect of Russian oil and gas being either disrupted through extended sanctions or actually weaponization of the Russian energy exports, as we've seen over the last few months. So what is it that the region faces, and what is it that the region can do and needs to do? The region has, for the longest time, had a fairly uncertain future with risks to prosperity, social cohesion, and political stability. The first point that I cannot make here is the discussions around peak oil and the forecasts that Melanie shared about the growth in EVs and its importance to the world of critical minerals. I think more significant here is the impact that will have on hydrocarbon demand, particularly oil demand. In its very latest World Energy Outlook, the IEA forecasts a decline in global oil consumption after the mid-2030s in its reference case, and even earlier in its climate constraint scenarios. But on the other hand, entities like OPEC or the Institute of Energy Economics in Japan forecast a continued increase in oil consumption in their base cases, with demand rising by about half a percentage point, even until 2045, 2050. More important than trying to fix whether oil consumption will peak at a certain point in time in the near future or not, to me, is the wide variation in these forecasts and the uncertainty that it creates for the region, and thus risks to the policy and commercial choices that governments and companies in the region have to make in preparing for the next few decades. The second challenge I'm going to flag here is something that, again, Melanie very eloquently described in one of her slides, is the huge growth in population that we will see in this region. Apart from the statistics that she shared, the UNICEF forecast a 50% increase in the population in the region between the ages of 20 and 60. So the largest growth in working age population in the world ever has seen in its history. Now, where this trend manifests itself, whether as a demographic dividend or a demographic burden, is a key question here. And this is something that I think is supremely important to the social cohesion and political stability in the region. I would submit that the Arab Spring did not start because a street vendor was assaulted by a policewoman in Tunisia, but had its roots in the fact that there's a large young population that will come of age, working age, in this region, which will need to have jobs and education and a quality of life that they see and feel with the growth in social media. So what's the region doing? In recognition of these two challenges, namely a potential pressure on energy sector revenue and a growing and young population, there have been a number of initiatives in the region. Nearly all the countries in the region have announced strategies of some form of economic restructuring or reform, focusing on economic diversification and a shift away from hydrocarbon dependence. These are things like the Saudi Vision 2030, the Abu Dhabi Economic Vision, New Kuwait 2035. All of these came to reform the economies away from an energy sector, diversify away from hydrocarbon, and increase employment opportunities, particularly in the kind of new energies that Richard and Melanie talked about. Added to this have been the net zero commitments that UAE and Saudi Arabia have made since Glasgow, or in the run up to Glasgow, and kind of reinforced in Sharm el-Sheikh last year. With demand for hydrocarbons slowing down and potentially peaking in the next few decades, these states have started to accelerate their energy transition to a lower carbon intensive production, economic diversification, investments in hydrocarbons, investments in carbon capture and sequestration, the projects that we saw flagged in Melanie's slides, and the production and distribution, I think importantly, of hydrogen becoming a new theme in the world of energy transition over the last few years. But importantly, I think there is also an effort in the region to ensure the sustainability of hydrocarbon demand by creating consumption channels where hydrocarbons are not necessarily combusted, the kind of things that Richard was talking about in his opening remarks, and especially in environmentally competitive sectors such as petrochemicals. And this has become a central part of the economic transformation that a large part of many countries and governments in this region are taking forward. I think what's also unique about all of these efforts in the region, unlike everywhere else in the world, is that the region is very uniquely positioned to finance the development towards the decarbonized economy with very, very large sovereign wealth funds and major national companies. So unlike, say, the energy transition in Europe or the US, this is not something that's being funded through capital market investments. These are large sovereign wealth funds that are able to kind of deploy themselves in a much more flexible and urgent fashion without necessarily going through years and years of review and processing. But I think also important in all of this diversification away from fossil fuel exports and towards non-fossil fuels is maintaining the central political and economic stability of the region. And this is where I again flag the need to significantly ramp up education and employment opportunities to make sure, again, that we do not end up with a demographic burden in the region, but a demographic dividend. The second leg of this strategy is what I call last man standing approach. For whatever it's worth, there will still be oil and gas consumption in even the year 2050. And oil and gas demand is still rising, even as the world is recovering from the COVID pandemic, especially in developing countries in Asia. Most of the world outside the Middle East has either reduced or completely stalled its investments in oil and gas, which have had kind of increasing pressures from environmental, social, and corporate governances, activists, even growth in supposedly elastic shale supply players has also been very, very tepid. And while investments in non-fossils have increased considerably, non-fossil fuel availability isn't at this point at any scale to replace fossil fuels in the kind of large volumes that we still need them. And in this context, two of the largest oil producers in the region have already committed to increasing their oil production over the next decades. Saudi Arabia has planned to increase its maximum sustained production to 13.4 billion by 2027, while the UAE is targeting a capacity of 5 million barrels by 2030. Essentially, these are the only two big investments that are happening in increasing oil production, which means that at whatever point in the future, when oil production from most other parts of the world has either stalled or declined to a point where it's not sustainable, these folks would be the only people who would be supplying the last barrels that we consume. Similarly, in natural gas, Qatar is expanding its LNG production capacity to 125 million tons by the year 2025. And to your point, Melanie, is likely to reclaim its position as the world's largest exporter of LNG from the US. This is the leg of the strategy that positions the region as a major supplier of oil and gas over the next few decades. I'd also use this opportunity to kind of talk about how the conflict in Europe has meant that the region has started to realign its short-term and long-term goals. Now, what we've seen with the current global crunch caused by sanctions on Russian oil and gas is that there is a change in the market dynamics and market balances around the world, especially between oil and gas exporters in the Middle East and oil and gas importing countries, particularly in the EU. In the medium to long term, North American and European buyers will permanently pare back purchases of Russian supply to insulate against the weaponization of Russian energy exports, especially Europe, that also aims to reduce its fossil fuel consumption, part of its commitment to decarbonization. And in the medium term, this leaves the Middle East to play a key role in backfilling lost Russian supply. Some of the largest suppliers of crude to the EU before the Russian war in Ukraine included Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar. And now the UAE and Kuwait have an opportunity to join this club. But what this means is a redirection of volumes currently exported elsewhere, including markets, growth markets in Asia, such as China and India. And this shift could become an important issue over the longer term. For whatever it's worth, Europe is not a growth market, nor is the US. Oil demand in Europe has declined by about 17% in the last decade, and has probably already peaked. On the other hand, growth in oil consumption and gas consumption in Asia continues to rise and will still be the largest growth markets, according to the IEA, in all of its scenarios. Thus, over time, the Middle East would want to reclaim its market share in this growth market, especially because this is a part of the world where they are able to charge premium prices. And what one would expect that as Russian ability to produce and export even kind of degrades over time due to sanctions, this allows the Middle East producers, both oil and gas, to kind of come back and reclaim market share in this very, very important part of the world, which still is a growth market. So let me kind of conclude by making a few final summary points. One, the Middle East will continue to remain a major supplier of global energy demand, particularly hydrocarbons, and let's not kind of diminish or mitigate that worldview. And this only production capacity expansion in the region that's going to increase their role in continued supply of oil and gas, as opposed to reduce investments in most other parts of the world. And in the case that Russian oil and gas kind of stops flowing into the European Union or the Western Hemisphere, there's a very strong possibility that it's barrels and molecules from this part of the world that make sure that lights and industries in the Western Hemisphere continue to go on. But the risks that the region continues to face, both in terms of being able to have a longer term horizon in their energy revenues, as well as being able to diversify into other sources of import revenues, and be able to make sure that their growing populations are well taken care of, is something that we have to be consciously aware of, especially if this region is destabilized. It will have implications, both security as well as economic, everywhere in the world. Let me kind of stop here and perhaps kind of carry on this conversation in Q&A and hand over to Tofur.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kaushik. It's an honor to be invited to speak on this topic, which is very important to me on a deeply personal level, not only professional, as a Qatari woman. And it's especially a true privilege to be among such a distinguished panel. Being the last speaker, I'd like to take this opportunity to circle back to the following questions, just to kind of bring back the discussion to what we were invited. And these are the questions that we were kind of posed as a panel. What trends do we see emerging in the field of energy? What insight has our personal experience granted us in the regional energy markets? And where do we see the future of Middle Eastern energy markets in the years and decades to come? With that, I'd like to begin. My fellow panelist, the distinguished Dr. Kaushik, made reference in his opening remarks to peak oil. And I think that's a very poignant topic, and I'd like to pick up on that note. Not long ago, peak oil theory was the hot topic, and everyone was worried that the world was running out of oil. I remember in 2010 and 2011, when shale and tight oil and gas were considered to be a complete myth, economically unviable and environmentally disastrous. Cut to the end of 2018, when the US became a net total energy exporter and started competing, and still is, with Qatar and Australia for the position of the top LNG exporter in the world. And all of this thanks to technologies that made tight oil and gas extraction economical, and regulations that enabled the sale and export of oil, gas, and products. I say these things briefly just to give some context before my remarks and to remind us all that the energy industry has seen its fair share of myths and dragons, of fables and fairy tales. The narrative has been sensational, the headlines provocative, and the one thing that's been consistent is that it's never been dull. Today, these are some of our headlines. Banks like HSBC are defunding carbon-intensive industries. Companies like the dairy manufacturer Danone are being sued in landmark laws for their use of plastics. And countries around the world are pledging to be net zero by the next half of the century. So to address the question of what's the trend right now, I think the trend is one of competing objectives. The first is where we as a global community would like to be, and two, where we actually are. I think where we would like to be as a trend is depicted quite clearly in the Paris Agreement targets set by nearly every country across the globe. We as a global community would like to reduce carbon emissions to not only achieve carbon neutrality, but also to decarbonize our economies and societies entirely. However, a reality that my colleagues have pointed out, and that is staring us all in the face as global citizens, is that the world population is growing, and so is the demand for energy. Not just any energy, but fast, reliable, and easy to access energy that's needed to fuel our economies, to move people and products, to sustain agriculture, and foster social and economic development. So, in order to make these competing objectives meet, we need cleaner energy, but we also need to make sure that those who have been deprived the most of energy have access to it and aren't left behind. That brings us to energy poverty. Unfortunately, that's another trend that currently exists, and it's only projected to get worse. While some countries, especially in the OECD, are projected to have populations that continue aging and shrinking, which presents its own problems, other regions, mainly in Africa, are expected to continue to experience population growth. The parts of the world with a growing number of young people are ironically burdened with shockingly limited energy access. So to put things in perspective, the United Nations projects that Nigeria's population will overtake that of the US by 2050, making it the third most populous country in the world by then, and that of China by the year 2100, making Nigeria the most populous country in the entire world. According to the World Bank, the rate of the Nigerian population without access to electricity has increased between 2016 and 2020. In fact, over 90 million people in Nigeria currently do not have access to electricity. This is reflected in the sub-Saharan African region, where nearly 80% of the population does not have access to electricity. I say all this because it highlights the increasing need for equitable access to energy as a vital resource for socioeconomic development. This is also reflected in the looming food scarcity trend that my colleague Melanie commented on, and we're currently seeing. According to the World Economic Forum, by 2050, the world population will reach nearly 10 billion people, and food demand will increase by 60% of what it is today. Stable and affordable energy is needed for affordable supply to be sustainable and meet that increasing global food demand. So that brings us to my view on where I see the future of the Middle East energy markets. I think that Middle Eastern energy suppliers are not only playing a leading role in the current iteration of the global energy transition, but in the region, we're taking risks and investing in the necessary innovations to go beyond that. In the current energy transition, natural gas undoubtedly plays an undeniable important role in meeting global demand in a cleaner and safer way. Qatar's leadership made a fantastic forward-looking investment in its natural gas reserves, which were originally discovered by Shell in the 70s and deemed uneconomical by BP until Mobil, now ExxonMobil, partnered with Qatar to make it what it is today, home to the largest natural gas reservoir in the world. Now, after Qatar's energy minister, His Excellency Saad Al-Kaabi, lifted the moratorium on gas development in 2017, Qatar has set a goal to raise the country's LNG production capacity to 126 million tons per annum by 2027, marking a 64% increase from the previous 77 million tons per annum, reasserting its position as a reliable and steady supplier of clean energy to the world, a position, might I add, that it reinforced by continuing to meet its supply commitments to all of its partners without prejudice during the blockade. Overall, in the Middle East, there are lots of notable investments in cleaner energy, as mentioned by my fellow panelists, and also into constructing green buildings, developing cleaner fuels, and investing in technologies both domestically and overseas. We've heard about the Gulf region's largest source of energy transition opportunities reflected in renewables, particularly solar power, especially given the favorable climate for photovoltaics. Also, in the area of blue hydrogen. By 2026, Saudi Arabia expects its first production of hydrogen from its $5 billion project in NEOM, which will be powered by renewable energy and produce 650 tons per day. Meanwhile, neighboring UAE has announced several hydrogen production projects and is expected to produce between 14 to 22 million tons per year by 2050. In fact, the UAE has 6 hydrogen projects under development at the cost of $1.6 billion, with a plan to supply about 25% of the global low carbon hydrogen market by 2030. Qatar plans to invest $1 billion in the world's largest blue ammonia plant, which can be then transformed into hydrogen. But it doesn't stop there. The UAE has invested over $40 billion in clean energy over the past 15 years and plans to invest 160 billion more over the next 30. In Saudi Arabia's Vision 2030, the country plans to invest $100 billion in renewables. But beyond the GCC, other Middle Eastern countries are also playing a leading role in the energy transition. Last April, Iraq announced a $680 million fund for renewable energy projects, which are aligned with Iraq's objective of 33% clean energy by 2030. Algeria focuses its energy transition on solar mainly, reforming its regulations to attract foreign investment to meet its ambitious targets of 15,000 megawatts of electricity generation capacity derived from renewables by 2035. So what do these plans and investments tell us? Middle Eastern energy producers are recognizing the need to change how we do things in order to have a sustainable world for future generations, both in the Middle East and beyond. And they're putting their money where their mouth is. And this brings me to the last of my remarks, where I hope to tie everything together. Over the years, the energy industry as a whole, and in particular, OPEC and Middle Eastern energy producers overall, have been targeted and labeled during debates regarding climate change. However, I think they have been and continue to be reliable suppliers of vital energy that the world demands for socioeconomic growth and development. What we need is dialogue in order to address the complex and sometimes competing demands of the world that we as global citizens, particularly in the most privileged parts of the socioeconomic strata, want to live in, and the dignity and equity that the poorest and most vulnerable people in the world deserve. The only way to achieve an equilibrium is by engaging in dialogue and safeguarding rights and incentives for innovation, technology, and investment to take place. I'd like to leave you with a parting thought that was shared by His Excellency, the late Mohammed Sanusi Barkindu, the former OPEC Secretary General, when he was asked, as he was quite frequently, about the topic of climate change and the role of energy producing countries. Of course, we must play a vital role in the energy transition. We too have children and grandchildren and live on the same planet. But let's remember our joint humanity and work together. Thank you.
Excellent, excellent remarks. Thank you to all of our panelists, and Tofel, thank you for ending on that note. That is so wise, right as we open our conversation for dialogue. I would like to invite our audience, if you have questions, you can submit them directly to me via the chat box to my name privately, or you could submit them over email to info@mepc.org. My first question, which is geared towards the entire panel, anyone feel free to jump in and ask or answer, is since the end of the Second World War, the United States has been a net importer of crude oil. However, many predict that 2023 can mark the end of this trend and the United States may become fully energy independent. If this occurs, what ramifications could we expect to see in US policy towards the Middle East? And furthermore, do you think that this would be a development with longevity and permanence, or a temporary consequence of sanctions on Russian oil and crude oil releases from the US Strategic Petroleum Reserve?
I'm happy to jump in and say a few words. I think the idea of the U.S. being energy independent, I've always had a problem with that, and that the definition of energy independence being a net exporter or not needing imports of oil, I think is a very 1978 view of oil and oil markets. Even if oil is traded on global markets, we all know that, and so the price of U.S. oil would be affected by the price of global oil. So I think that we need to think about energy and oil and all of these things as allies and trading partners, and that securing the supply chains is what protects everyone's energy security. I would say that that is especially important for what I showed earlier on the metals and minerals. We are importing metals and minerals like crazy. Those supply chains need to be secure, and because I have a slide for everything, I have a slide that shows the various forums that the world, our allies and trading partners, need to be working together in to protect those supply chains. And just one other final thought on that. We have tended to think of our energy security as based on oil, and we think about the fuels. Okay, we tend to think of as fuels. The metals and minerals for a clean energy future, it's capital costs, and so the lifespan of the technologies for those clean energy that use those clean energy metals and minerals, the lifespan becomes an additional measure of energy security. And we need to get accurate measures and understanding of those lifespans for another addition to the energy security equation. So.
Excellent. Thank you, Melanie.
Can,
Dr. Deb, I see your hand is up.
Yes, so I mean, echoing everything that Melanie said, that you have to kind of start thinking of energy security, not just in terms of the barrels and where you get them, but also the price at which you are able to obtain those barrels. And to the extent that the oil market is a global market, you may not necessarily need to bring in new barrels into your country, but you certainly have to pay a market price for that. And it's kind of instructive here to also remember that the kind of oil and the kind of liquids that the US is producing is not necessarily what the US refining industry is geared towards. So this is very well going to be a situation where the US is not a net importer of crude barrels, but is still importing crude barrels to be able to provide a refinery mix that its Gulf Coast refineries are able to produce product slates on. But also a final thought on that, I mean, thinking about the US involvement in the Middle East, particularly the Gulf, only through the lens of crude oil is perhaps not the complete picture. I'm sure there are many strategic and important interests that the US has in the region, because of which its deployment of troops and navies in the region would continue, especially given the fact that allies of the US would still depend on crude and oil from the Middle East. But I also wanted to use this time that I have the mic to bring out a couple of points that I think Topol very eloquently raised. One is the way she kind of talked about peak oil. I remember when I did my doctoral work, there were a whole bunch of my colleagues in the building who were working on peak oil demand and how that was such a fashionable topic to kind of work on. And today, if you walk into any serious economics or energy school and you say that you want to do a doctoral degree on peak oil, they probably will throw you out in a few seconds. But I'd also kind of encourage us to remember that this is different. This is different because this is not peak oil supply that we're talking about, but peak oil demand. And you can kind of go back and look at transitions, not just in energy, but in almost every field of resource that we use. Every time we've transitioned, it's because the patterns of demand and production have changed. You remember the famous quote that the Stone Age it didn't end because we ran out of stones, but it did end because we did not need stones anymore. So it's kind of important to remember that the conversation around peak oil now is serious and is important. And it's the uncertainty around that makes kind of everything so interesting and dynamic and complex. Very useful for analysts like me, but I'm sure kind of my colleagues and friends in oil companies must be tearing their hair out. The second thing I just wanted to also take off from where Topol kind of pointed out about the efforts outside the GCC in the process of energy transition. I think it's important to make this distinction between folks who have the money to be able to support the energy transition. And here I'm kind of thinking particularly about the GCC. And then people outside the GCC who do not necessarily have the ability to be able to finance the energy transition. And a number of these were so eloquently put in Melanie's slides, especially in North Africa or even closer to Iraq, where the energy transition is going to be a lot more difficult, complex, expensive, and would require a lot more support from the rest of the world.
Excellent. Topol, you have a comment?
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to just follow up on Melanie's point about the need for alliances, global alliances for every country, but in regards to this particular question, the US, that even after achieving energy independence, in the case of the US achieving complete energy independence, as Melanie mentioned, metals are very, very incredibly important for batteries, which we will need to store energy, energy that's produced by renewables, and lithium, nickel, cobalt, copper. These are all the basins for these metals are in Australia, Bolivia, Chile, Argentina. They're across the world. For nickel, Indonesia, Philippines, Russia. That's one area. And then again, I just bring it back to food security, which I think is absolutely important. Yes, we absolutely the world needs energy. And, I can't emphasize that enough. But as I mentioned in my remarks, food scarcity is a real topic. And that's something that, who needs fuel for the car if they're starving? If you have, starving populations, which we do have, unfortunately, today, and it's perceived to increase. And the top food producing countries are China, India, the US itself, Brazil. Now we've seen the crisis with wheat shortages because of the crisis in Ukraine. So I think that we as a world, we will always be interdependent, and we will need each other. And that's just something that we have to accept and work together.
Thank you. Melanie?
I wrote down food security, Topol, as something I wanted to raise again, because you mentioned it earlier. And it was in our discussion yesterday, and people need to, I had thought about it before. Food security is very natural gas dependent. It's how you make fertilizer. And so natural gas is basically, and the fertilizer that you make from it is going to be very, very important for increasing global food production. And we can't lose sight of that. But I wrote down food security. I also wrote down water security. And very important for the MENA region. But also, Tofo, you mentioned South America. South America, probably 75% of their countries rely on glacier-fed hydro. And guess what? The glaciers are melting. And it's a problem in the northwestern United States and the Himalayas as well. And so it's not just food security, water security in a traditional sense, like we are very worried about it in the Middle East and MENA region, but it's other issues that we use water for. And so I just want to throw those two things out on the table and then say one other thing. And it's back to the original question about oil and energy independence. When Secretary Moniz was secretary, I went to him in 2014 and I said, oil is a very outdated way to think of energy security, and we need to modernize our definition of energy security. And so we wrote up some principles. Climate change, huge is energy security issue. Natural gas has grown as a global resource in need. Innovation, et cetera. And we took those principles to Rome, negotiated them with the G7 energy ministers. They were adopted by the G7 principles in Brussels in 2014. But since then, cybersecurity has entered. We hadn't even thought of it in 2014. And nor have we thought about minerals as a global energy security concern. So those things need to be constantly updated as our energy systems change. And just want to throw that out for the audience to think about as well. So.
Excellent. We have a question from Mr. Norman Rule, who is affiliated with the National Security Institute and has a very long distinguished career with the CIA in the MENA region and writes frequently for the Cypher Brief on these issues. His thoughts are, quote, "We increasingly hear about important green energy developments in the Middle East. Partnerships between regional countries and foreign firms are routine. Reports of bilateral or multilateral partnerships among regional actors are less common. Recently, we heard reports of Gulf investment in Egyptian energy projects and Iraq connecting to the GCC electricity grid. He would welcome panelists' remarks on cooperation on regional green energy initiatives."
I can weigh in a bit on that. Historically, what we've seen is a significant amount of work that's kind of gone on in the region, recognizing that greater cooperation and integration of their energy markets will lead to some amount of saving as well as increased efficiency in the entire energy grid. However, a lot of the cooperation has been stalled and hindered by the fact that in large parts of the Middle East, energy is subsidized. So if you're subsidizing electricity in one country and you have an integrated energy grid, then where is the energy subsidy traveling from and to? To be able to resolve a lot of these issues in terms of financial transfers has been a much more complex exercise. But the progress that the region has made on electricity transmission grid integration has been a lot more effective than, for instance, it's made on having a regional gas grid. For whatever it's worth, electricity transmission grids integration between, as you described, between Iraq and GCC, as well as between the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and Egypt, are initiatives that kind of take this forward, but there still remain issues to be resolved in terms of how the financial transfers reflecting the level of subsidies and the cost of generation within the region are affected. Within this, I think a kind of a much more significant and an important recognition also is of the fact that there are parts of the energy system that are much more efficient within the region than other countries within the region. So for instance, the Saudis in the 1980s realized that the natural gas can be a very important resource, just like the Qataris did in the 70s. And despite the fact that natural gas at that point had a price equivalent to, I guess, zero or a minus value, they still invested in a system that took care of all the leakages and flaring and monetized that gas in the national, in the gas master system, in the master gas system. That's not something that kind of other players in the region have been able to do. So the amount of flaring, for instance, that happens in Iraq is, I would say, kind of brought it to the point of criminal. If Iraq was able to collect all of that natural gas and monetize it and generate electricity, then Iraq might be a net exporter of electricity than having to import electricity from its regional partners.
Melanie, thank you.
Yeah, I wanted to say hi to Norm Rule. Hi, Norm, how are you? So nice to hear from you. And thanks for asking tough questions, Norm. That's not a shock. But let me say, I think that, and I mentioned in the beginning, a lot of regional similarities. That's why I started with the MENA region. That's why we had the workshop that covered the MENA region for the global gas study. And looking for areas of cooperation in the clean energy future might be an important way to start laying additional groundwork for regional cooperation. And let me throw out a couple things. Hydrogen is one of them. And right now in the world, hydrogen is priced as a specialty chemical. Okay, so it's bilateral contract specialty chemical. If we start using hydrogen as an energy commodity, we're going to need pricing mechanisms like we have for oil, and like we have regional pricing mechanisms for natural gas. And so I think hydrogen, I think a lot of countries in the MENA region very interested in hydrogen. I showed that in one of my slides. And working together on developing that kind of a pricing mechanism that would support regional development might be an area where the countries in the region could cooperate. And the other area, and I think that the region could be a leader here, and we need leadership, is in accurate accounting of greenhouse gas emissions. Right now, there are a lot of fairy stories about greenhouse gas emissions out there. Not a lot of discussion of the 3,000 tons of cement that you need to anchor a 5 megawatt wind turbine, and how much emissions are associated with that. Those kinds of issues. The supply chains I showed you. Global shipping. It's accounted in no country's NDC. The global shipping, it's only 3% of the total in the world, but when you're talking net zero, that becomes very important. So working together in the region to develop the data to inform basically the circular economy could be another area of cooperation for countries in the region. So.
Excellent, thank you. So in line with the concept of regional energy cooperation agreements, we saw that following the implementation of the Abraham Accords in 2020, Israeli companies have brokered several agreements in the Arab world in order to combat pressing regional climate concerns. Examples include a deal to install Israeli desalination devices in the UAE and a deal to provide Jordan with fresh water in return for solar energy. How optimistic should parties be regarding the unifying potential of combating climate crisis in the MENA region? And although these recent deals appear promising, are there specific examples of situations where climate/environmental issues may lead to conflict instead of cooperation? Okay, don't everybody jump up at once.
It requires a little thought where, I mean, I
Well-
think that water might be an area, in the region, in a water scarce region, without regional structural cooperation efforts, okay? And so that's one area that came to mind to me first. Although the example you use is how it is desalination and cooperation in that regard. But I think that water is something that jumps to mind for me right away, but not right away, a little slowly, okay, because we were all slow answering. Okay,
Dr. Deb, do you have
me-
thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, so to me, kind of, at least this one space is a lot more competitive than cooperative. I think countries and also companies in the region will scramble hard to be able to deliver on emission reductions, environmental improvements, as well as kind of the very esoteric for now, net zero commitments that have been made. So there is a larger possibility of cooperation between entities in the region, I mean, national oil companies and countries, with other countries outside the region. So for instance, a partnership between Aramco and a petchem company in China or in Korea, or stuff that the region can kind of do in countries such as Brazil and South Africa, rather than kind of more cooperation between countries and companies within the region. Simply because I think this is really competition for being able to improve your environmental and climate standards. And this does not necessarily behoove greater cooperation. To the extent that the sovereign wealth funds of the region can play a role, I think is going to be somewhat more interesting. And that's where I think, again, the distinction being able to make between GCC countries and non-GCC countries in the region might allow for some cooperation.
I have one other thought on that. And I think you alluded to it earlier, and my other colleagues on the panel. And it's not unrelated to the data issue that I just raised, but I think that no region in the world has a greater interest than developing a thoughtful sequence path for deep decarbonization, and a realistic and a practical pathway to deep decarbonization. And again, the workshop we had yesterday, it is impossible right now to run in the US. I haven't looked at the details in the MENA region, to run a grid on wind and solar without fuel as a backup. And right now in the US, that fuels natural gas. It could be hydrogen in the future. You're making hydrogen from natural gas right now. But I would give one example of why that's important. In California, we did a study there, looked at wind and solar generation every day of the year in 2017. California had 90 days with no wind. And 10 days in a row with no wind. And the battery storage that we're also supportive of developing is 4 hours, grid scale batteries right now. And so thinking these things through in a very thoughtful and practical way, I think is important for the region and could help inform the world on how to do some of these, take some of these deep decarbonization measures and the practical ways for doing so.
Excellent, thank you. Iranian oil exports have reached new highs in the last 2 months of 2022 and are making a strong start in 2023, despite US sanctions on the country. What impact could this have on Iran's role in the global sphere and US-Iranian relations? And do you foresee Iran being willing to partner and transition towards clean energy in the midst of a burgeoning oil economy?
Well, I mean, I can certainly speak to the immediate aspect around this. I think a large part of the increase in Iranian oil production over the last few months has been, shall we say, the American administration kind of just looking away and allowing Iranian barrels to kind of enter the market so that the market remains well supplied and we don't end up in a situation where we are again facing the prospects of $100 plus oil. This actually has been a fairly significant part of the reason why prices have remained muted through this winter, and is going to be central to the world and particularly the administration in the Western Hemisphere to make sure that there's no shortage of barrels in the market. A lot of these barrels are still flowing into Asia, but we might also kind of want to remind ourselves of two things. One, the prospects of Iranian barrels coming to the market in some sort of a new deal that's brokered around the nuclear sanctions is as close to impossible as it possibly ever was. With the Iranian involvement in the crisis in Ukraine on the side of the Russians, I think any possibility of cooperation on that count, any further progress on talks in Vienna is near impossible. But also, when sanctions were removed the last time around 2016 or Iran was able to ramp up its production very, very dramatically. It went from just about 1 million barrels to about nearly 4 million barrels within a matter of a few months. So we shouldn't kind of discount that possibility, but the probability that possibility is eventually realized is much too slim. Now, where does that leave Iran in terms of its energy transition? Frankly, kind of a country that's kind of barely managing to chug along and offering all of these barrels at enormous amounts of discounts, probably at a level of discounts that the Russians are offering to the market, is not something that behoves well for a country that wants to poise itself for an energy transition. And that's where I'll leave it.
Excellent. Tofel, what are your thoughts?
I'd just like to speak on the second part of the question regarding Iran's ambitions or plans in the energy transition. And as Dr. Kaushik has correctly and very eloquently stated, that the country is, they're facing setbacks from sanctions. And so there's kind of more immediate needs that are pressing needs that are being addressed by the country. But I'd just like to point out that in spite of the sanctions, last year, I keep forgetting which year we're in. Yes, in January 22 last year, the Energy Ministry in Iran announced plans to add 10 gigawatts of renewable energy capacity, including hydropower, by the end of 2026 to achieve their long-term target of a cumulative renewable capacity of 30 gigawatts of energy. And their energy efficiency organization called SATBA, they signed an MOU with private investors to execute that plan. And we're trying to raise funds. And there were reports that they'd raised something around, or they were aiming to raise something around $70 million in their budget to reach those plans. Now, of course, due to the sanctions and the absence of a deal, these are the setbacks that are being faced. But I do think it's an important question. It's important to point out that yes, that Iran also in the Middle East is an interested party in the energy transition, as the rest of the region is.
Thank you, Melanie.
I'd just like to say that Iran aside, oil sanctions, it's a global oil market. So again, basically, but for transportation and quality of oil, there's a single price for oil. And so sanctions on gas exports, which are much more transportation constrained and infrastructure constrained, I think are having a much greater impact on Russia, for example, than sanctions on oil. So just a thought on sanctions in general.
Thank you. Recently at the World Economic Forum on January 17th, His Excellency Saudi Foreign Minister Prince Faisal bin Farhan discussed the kingdom's partnership with the United States and described how crucial that partnership is for the global economy. With regard to clean energy, he said, quote, Saudi Arabia is committed to transitioning towards a clean energy future, but the switch could take decades. Will this slow phasing out and transition towards clean energy be adequate in tackling pressing climate change needs? And do you think that the use of traditional fuels to spur developing economies towards clean energy capabilities is wise? Tofel, do you want to take this one?
Sure, thank you. I think that the energy transition taking decades isn't, something specific to Saudi Arabia or any single country. This is not only a technological transition that needs to take place, but also one for entire economies to adapt and evolve to just put things in perspective, for jobs, to build capacities, and just to evolve. That's one point I'd like to make. And then another, just the question alludes to whether whether the energy transition takes decades or takes time, if that's going to have consequences on the environment. And I would just say that the larger, more poignant consequences are more to do with the more carbon intensive countries, that the economies that need to reduce their carbon emissions the most. I think that's where the question really lies for all of us, on a global perspective. And it's not just Saudi Arabia. I think it's more of a US issue. It's more of China and India. And I think that's where the, Paris talks have, that's where they've been kind of, those have been the most challenging points. So thank you.
Thank you, Melanie.
Yeah, the question you asked, it kind of goes back to a point I raised earlier about the need for a practical sequenced transition and a thoughtful plan for how to get there for the countries of the world, regions of the world, and the world. And I would, couple of examples or IEA, for example, said, and this is a quote, "It is virtually impossible for the world to reach net zero without CCS." Okay, hugely important. A lot of opposition in many circles in the world. But IEA said, and I agree with them, it's virtually impossible to reach net zero without CCS. And so that's one of the technologies that, when you're talking practical sequenced pathway to get to net zero or low carbon emissions, one of the things that we need to be looking at in the region, investing in, and very, very important. And one other thing, and I think Tofel, you alluded to this too, the need to look at the workforce needs, the employment needs of people in the MENA region and elsewhere. And we have spent a lot of time crosswalking conventional energy jobs to clean energy jobs, and what skill sets do you need for clean energy jobs that you can find with minimal training that meet clean energy needs. And CCS again is one of those countries and economies that rely on oil and gas the workers have enormous knowledge of the subsurface. So how can you translate that knowledge of the subsurface into something like CCS? Oil and gas companies have enormous knowledge of hydrogen and piping hydrogen and et cetera, and the infrastructure needs, pipelines, et cetera, shipping, all of those things are skill sets that you would find in conventional oil and gas that would be very relevant to crosswalk to hydrogen. And so just a few thoughts on how we might be thinking about workers and transitioning to a clean energy economy. And one other point, and I've thought about this over and over again, the only commodity that is sold and traded in every country of the world is oil. And so the knowledge that countries in the MENA region have about other countries and entree and the diplomatic relationships, the financial relationships that are associated with supplying oil to many parts of the world could be translated into other supply chain needs for clean energy, metals and minerals, for example. So just a few thoughts on how we might translate some jobs into clean energy jobs. So.
That is an excellent point, Melanie.
just
Yes,
kind of
go ahead,
weigh
Dr.
in.
Beck.
So yeah, I wanted to make kind of three broad points on this issue. I think one, kind of framing it in terms of an either or is not really a helpful framing of the problem. There are parts of the world which would increase their energy consumption as their prosperity increases, and a large part of those populations kind of get to some viable point of economic living. But the space has to be created by the large energy consumers today in terms of other people in the world being able to kind of reach levels of development. Just to give you an example, India has kind of completed a fairly expansive process of adding every household to the electricity grid. But India's electricity consumption is like about an eighth of what China's is today, or about a 20th of what the US is today. So even if India was to go to the non-OECD average, forget getting to a level of a China or the US, the increase in electricity consumption would require adding, take a guess, 900 new power plants of about 500 megawatts each. So it's a fairly big thing. But the important thing to recognize is that space has to be created for a large part of the world to still develop and grow. The second point I kind of make is that this framing of the issue that we've seen a number of oil companies particularly make, not just in the region, but also international oil companies, that you're certainly more conscious about the fact that there are large parts of the world which do not have access to electricity or energy, and energy poverty is certainly an issue. Well, energy poverty has been an issue for the last 50 years or even longer. And the fact that we've had a global oil and gas market for this long a time, and there are people who are still suffering from energy poverty, is likely an disingenuous argument to make for your own sustenance and existence. So there is some amount of talking to the market that's happening there, and we have to be kind of careful about what that means. But also just a minor geeky thing about looking at everything in per capita terms. I remember from one of the slides that Melanie had that the Middle East per capita carbon emissions are about about 1 ton higher than the global average. It's also useful to remember that the Middle East populations are fairly small, and a large part of their energy consumption comes from the migrant worker population that's not counted within their population statistics. So it's kind of useful to be aware of how these numbers are calculated and how these numbers are put forth, and how they are kind of interpreted. So just something that I think it's hard for someone sitting in a university chair to get away from.
Melanie, did you have something you wanted to add?
No, I just took my hand down, sorry.
Okay, no worries.
I forgot from before.
Next question is, the Saudi Energy Minister, His Excellency Prince Abdulaziz bin Salman, recently announced that the kingdom plans to use domestically sourced uranium for nuclear power initiatives. And aside from Saudi Arabia, 5 other Middle Eastern countries have voiced ambitions for nuclear power development, with the UAE creating the region's first multi-unit operating nuclear energy plant. One, do you think nuclear power has the potential to meet a large share of the region's energy demands, or will other clean energy sources potentially dominate? And what challenges does nuclear production face in the Middle East?
I alluded to that earlier, that conventional energy both consumes and withdraws a lot of water. So your conventional energy reactors use a lot of water. The MENA region is water scarce. Saudi Arabia has done a lot on desalination. So I think that addresses some of the concerns about water, makes it more expensive. Okay, and conventional nuclear is generally more expensive. And so than other generation sources. What I would say is small modular reactors are becoming increasingly important in the whole scheme of things. They don't use the kind of water that a large conventional nuclear power plant does. And they have another benefit that I think we need to be thinking about too, is using small modular reactors for making hydrogen. And right now, conventional reactors from in the US, from an economic perspective, because of their economics, they have to run flat out. So their capacity factors are 90%, which basically means, but for maintenance, et cetera, they're running flat out. There's no surplus nuclear to make green hydrogen. If you could small modular reactors, you might be able to make purpose-built nuclear reactors to make hydrogen. So I think it could be important in the future in that respect as well. So thinking about and investing and paying a lot of attention to SMR development, I think could be very helpful for the region.
Hopeful?
Yes, I think that when looking at nuclear energy, I think it is undoubtedly regaining popularity as a source of meeting energy security demands, especially while lowering carbon emissions. But at the same time, we have to remember that while the cost of other renewable energy comes down, like wind and solar, as it has been in recent years, that makes those technologies much more attractive, particularly when considering the risks that come with nuclear energy and the crises that we've seen, the 2011 Fukushima meltdown, and also the national security risks that come with what's happening now, Russia shelling Europe's largest nuclear power plant in Ukraine. So I think that nuclear power is, of course, an important contender, but I do think that other forms of clean energy will be more popular in the region and elsewhere.
So, I mean, if I can just kind of take off from that, I think between Melanie and Topol, there's to me, a very clear distinction of whether it should and whether it will. So, I mean, nuclear, of course, has a great role that it could play in providing baseload electricity consumption for a large part of the region. But the fact of the matter is that the region already had that option of replacing oil that it burns for power consumption using natural gas, but it hasn't been able to do that effectively. Now, to what extent would a new technology in the region, not kind of generally, be able to provide a large amount of replacement for existing fossil fuel in the power sector is something that I kind of always put a question mark on. And the nuclear industry itself hasn't been one that's kind of generated a great amount of confidence around the world. And I'm not referring to their safety, record, which kind of, at least to me, is significantly better than the rest of the energy system. but more along the lines of being able to deliver projects on time and on cost. Now, if that changes, then then there's a conversation to be had. But in the absence of that, I mean, nuclear is one of those things that we should kind of always, as energy modelers, include in our projections, but not as commercial developers think about very seriously.
Can I say something too? And the kind of taking back something I said. Nuclear. I said something about nuclear being expensive, and it is a lot more expensive than gas generation. But wind and solar, and we typically look at numbers. A lot of, and you read it, I read it, one New York Times story 3 times in one story, that that wind and solar are cheaper than gas and coal generation. Not when you include the cost of storage. And including the cost of storage puts wind and solar generation at a much at higher than natural, way higher than natural gas, and higher than conventional nuclear. And so that's something that another area of innovation and where we might want to cooperate with Saudi Arabia. Another area of innovation is long duration storage and getting the cost down. There's a lot of renewable resources in the MENA region, but storage is expensive. And as I mentioned earlier, it's 4 hours. And so it tends to be linear. If you need 8 hours, you need twice as much battery storage. So working together on that in a region that has a lot of renewable wind and solar resources, or solar resources certainly, working together to get the cost down of storage and longer duration storage might be an important area too.
Excellent, thank you. Pivoting to COP. Many climate activists have criticized the final COP27 agreement for its failure to advocate for a phasing down or phasing out of oil and gas, attributing this missing element to the 600 fossil fuel lobbyists who were present at the conference. What are your thoughts on the final COP27 agreement, and are these goals realistic and timely?
Anyone? I think that it's not practical, okay, to immediately phase out oil and gas. And the transition off oil and gas is going to be a very long process. It's going to be, there'll be a lot of regional differences. And we need to figure out how to accommodate those regional differences, the differences in costs, the differences in time scale, the differences in the impacts on the populations like the MENA region, and accommodate those vis-a-vis policy and technology.
Excellent, thank you. So per Topol's remarks, her opening remarks, she mentioned that essentially in 2022 alone, the UAE invested over $40 billion into environmentally friendly energy infrastructure, reinforcing its status as a global leader in the clean energy field. Meanwhile, it's been criticized for the recent appointment of Sultan Al Jaber, the CEO of the Abu Dhabi National Oil Company, to preside over the COP28 talks in Dubai. Could you please explain the dichotomy of the UAE as both a leader in the clean energy push, as well as an economy that is reliant on the production of petroleum? And what are some of the motivations for the UAE to invest so heavily in renewable energy when they have the 7th highest total oil reserves worldwide?
Yes, I think that's an excellent question. I think it is, it's the basis of my entire opening remarks. I think that there is no one better positioned to lead the discussions on renewable energy and the energy transition than energy producers themselves. I think that particularly as developing countries, which the MENA region are, and OPEC member countries across MENA, Africa, Latin America they're developing countries, so they understand the needs for others that are in their same shoes, while in order to prosper and to grow, while at the same time being the custodians of the fossil fuels that are, in their countries. So I don't think that it's ironic in any way, shape, or form that an energy producing country would be engaging or leading in the COP talks. That applies to all energy producing countries. And in fact, I would, as a global citizen, I would be rather alarmed if these fossil fuel rich countries were not at the table. I think the bigger question is, where are the CO2 emitters in all this? I think that we need a lot of engagement from them. As fossil fuel producers, yes, that's a CO2 intensive industry. So we want those countries to speak and to be involved and to lead, but also we want the consuming countries to be as actively involved. So I think it's fantastic news, and I would love to see much more participation from CO2 intensive countries and parties in climate talks.
Excellent. Thank you, Melanie.
Yeah, I just wanted to echo Tofal's remarks. I think it's an excellent choice, and I really appreciate that we would be in trouble if the oil producing and energy producing countries were not at the table in climate discussions. And I think that there is no better leader to develop a plan coming out of COP28 for the practical sequenced pathways that the world needs to get to deep decarbonization. No better leader than Sultan Al Jaber. So.
Excellent, thank you. Recently, Israel just issued its first 10-year green bonds, raising $2 billion to fund initiatives that will contribute to the goal of reaching net zero emissions by 2050. They are the 24th country to issue green bonds, and demand amounted to $12 billion, 6 times the bond availability, attracting investors from the US, UK, Germany, and the UAE. Do you think green bonds are a viable option for other Middle Eastern countries to increase funding for clean energy initiatives?
If I could say, I don't have I think that green bonds in the region are will be very helpful for investing. But as I mentioned earlier, and we're talking to a lot of investment companies who don't know how green is green and I mentioned earlier, we need accurate measurements for the life cycle emissions of all of these things. And investors need to know the answer to that question as well. How green is green? And I think that as I mentioned, the MENA region developing some accurate measures of what constitutes green and what the emissions are, life cycle emissions of the range of energy sources and products, I think would be very important for investors. So,
if I
Dr.
can also
Deb?
kind of weigh in on this. I mean, it's kind of instructive to think about what are the countries that have issued green bonds and where the subscriptions have been actually higher than what was solicited. And this is kind of where I think the sovereign credibility of the governments themselves or the companies themselves kind of becomes important. It's not surprising that Israel was able to have a green bond issue, and a successful one at that. I can quite very well imagine that if PIF or Mubadala went into the market with a similar offering, it would be very well subscribed. But I'd be really, really surprised if the Ministry of Finance in Iran was able to have that amount of success. But for that matter, even countries in North Africa. So we have to be kind of careful when we, as Melanie was saying, kind of thinking about how green these bonds are, because who are the people who are kind of coming and taking advantage of these opportunities? Are they looking at whether these are good projects, good companies with balance sheets and financial standing, or this is actually something that merits a premium just because it has the letter word green in it? We also kind of wait to see how this money is deployed and see what projects are actually funded out of this. And that's kind of still something that the market is getting used to. And we've seen in the US particularly how significant has been the pushback on ESG-based funding, even coming from very large financial institutions or the likes of BlackRock, etc. So still kind of space to be litigated.
Excellent, thank you. Russia's invasion of Ukraine and subsequent Russian sanctions have caused an energy crisis to reverberate around the world. Import-reliant countries have had to rally to meet their short-term energy demands, but also consider longer-term energy security in the face of potential conflicts and disruptions. Do you think the present energy crisis has helped to propel clean energy projects and investments, or delayed them?
A bit of both, no? I mean, if you think about it, just the desperation that Europe has had for trying to replace the fossil fuel molecules that used to come from Russia has increased the amount of investment or the deployment of capital that they've had to put in to bring in more fossil fuel molecules and barrels into the continent. Think about it. This time, 2 years back, did Europe or the EU consider natural gas as a green fuel? And how things have changed, right? I mean, the US LNG suppliers have probably never have had it so good as they have it today, but just because Europe so desperately wants fossil fuels. But another important stat from 2022 is that German imports of solar panels from China went up by 70%. So it's all of the above. It's all of the above that strategy that a large part of the Middle East has been kind of arguing that you need more of every form of energy, and you need to have a process of energy transition. That's a process of energy evolution, and not just one of switching from one system to another. Equally, this has also provided opportunity for a large part of Asia to be able to source cheaper barrels and molecules, and be able to kind of use those to generate a large amount of revenue, and use some of those funds and some of those capital deployments to invest in things like hydrogen or renewable energy. A number of conglomerates in China and India have kind of made announcements to that effect, and are, I think, benefiting from this unique opportunity that the conflict has created, if there was going to be a silver lining from something that is as tragic as the war in Ukraine.
Melanie?
I started smiling when you mentioned gas as green. When I left the Department of Energy in 2001, I worked for the entire Clinton administration. Bill Richardson was Energy Secretary at the end of the Clinton administration, and I actually married Bill's best friend from college and used to be his chief of staff too. So I've known him a long time. Called him up. I was offered a job at the Gas Technology Institute and called him up to ask him what his thoughts were. Should I take the job? And his answer to me was gas, green, good. In 2001, natural gas was viewed as being very, very green. And so there's been a major shift in views on natural gas. And so I just because I'm a data freak, in 1 year, 2 countries in Asia, 2 countries alone, China and India, had under construction, not announced projects, 165,000 megawatts of coal generation. Okay, and the entire US fleet that year was 235,000 megawatts. So 2 countries, 1 year under construction. Getting some of those plants to run on natural gas as opposed to coal would make a big difference in CO2 emissions. And then I'd say one other thing, and I mentioned the energy security principles that we negotiated at the G7. One of those principles was diversification of sources of supply, and particularly gas supply. And we were completely shocked about Nord Stream 2 and made Europe and Germany in particular, very, very dependent on Russian gas, and see what the impact is of that. And then I said finally twice, have I mentioned before, we need practical sequence solutions to climate change. There are no alternatives for process heat for industrial purposes. You can't get the temperatures from electricity. You need a fuel for your industrial sector. And I think that was very important to Germany. Right now, they're very dependent on it for buildings and heat too, but there are alternatives to that. There are no alternatives to natural gas in industry right now. So,
Topol, would you like to add anything?
I was just going to say that I agree completely with Dr. Kaushik's comment, answering the question of whether the military national security crises currently taking place, if they have been better or worse for the energy transition. And I agree with him, it's a bit of both. And as Melanie has mentioned, coal has been the coal consumption has increased consequently, especially in the European Union, due to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Several EU countries have extended the lifelines of some coal plants that were supposed to be closing down, and they've even reopened closed plants or raised caps on the operating hours of those plants just to reduce gas consumption. So it's kind of plugging, just trying to put out immediate fire, while at the same time having this concern and demand from the population for cleaner energy and to meeting the Paris Agreement targets.
Excellent, thank you. I just had an audience question submitted from Mr. Jason Lee, who is an Asia scholar with the Stimson Center. His question is, what is China's role in facilitating the Middle East energy transition? What areas of collaboration would be most meaningful for Middle Eastern recipients of potential Chinese capital?
I mean, the Belt and Road investments in the Middle East from China have been so significant for both the Chinese parties, but also for countries in the Middle East. And that kind of, I think, was so eloquently underscored with President Xi's visit to Saudi Arabia earlier this month. The pictures that kind of came out from that are, I think, a testament to strong potential for partnership between the regions. But I think there are also kind of significant challenges or natural constraints to that. One should not kind of think, for instance, China to have the kind of influence that it does have in countries in Africa, to have the same amount of influence on the regional parties in the GCC, particularly since the mutual interdependence between the two, one hungry for cheap energy and the other possibly the lowest cost supplier of hydrocarbons in the world. There is kind of a natural partnership focused principally on that. There has been some mention of cooperation on hydrogen and on nuclear and a variety of these frontier topics in the MOUs I forget now, with the hundreds of odd MOUs that were signed between the counterparties during President Xi's visit to Saudi Arabia. But I still think that the large amount of interdependence between the regions in terms of energy producing and energy consuming is going to be the underpinning and or the centrality of their relationship. Having said that, how far can China go on doing this with growth rates of close to 2% or 3% on a longer term perpetuity basis is also something that one will have to test as one kind of goes over the rest of the years of this decade.
Excellent. Melanie?
No, I was just, I'm going to have to go. That's why.
Oh, okay. Well, I did want to say it quickly because we are
Yeah.
mindful of time.
Right.
We will be closing. However, our wonderful fearless leader, President Richard Schmier, former ambassador to Oman, has a question he would like to ask the panelists. So if we can end with him, that'll be perfect.
Great.
Rich?
Thank you, Bosman. Thank you to all of our panelists. I had sort of a question, but it's actually more of a quote. My counterpart at the Atlantic Council, Fred Kempe, recently published an op-ed, and I'll read the first line, and maybe each of you can give me a yes or no answer. If the world gets lucky, this could be the year fossil fuel producers and climate activists bury their hatchets and join hands to reduce emissions and ensure our planet's future. It's not really a question, but I think our panel discussion today really helped us get a good look at that broader issue. I know we're out of time, so I don't have time for a lot of comments, but I think all of you are involved in an effort which will actually help us get to the point where all parties are cooperating to try to help us resolve the issues you've discussed today. So thank you for that. And I guess, Basma, back to you. I think we have to close. Our time is out.
We will. So just one final, any closing remarks anybody on the panel wants to add before we say goodbye? Or we're good?
Thank you for this really
Great.
excellent
Thank you.
discussion, and
Thank you very
loved
much.
being part of this.
What a great way to start the day. Thank you. Have a great